They called him the Trash Prince because he couldn't hold a sword without shaking. Then he died, came back, and started forging weapons that made the gods nervous. His name is Caelum Voss, third prince of the Aldrich Empire, born into a family of legendary warriors. His father, Emperor Darius, once split a mountain in half during a border dispute. His older brother Lucian was commanding armies before he could shave. His sister Seraphina mastered the royal sword arts at 11. Caelum mastered the art of disappointing everyone at roughly the same age. No combat talent, no magical affinity, no martial aptitude whatsoever. In an empire that measured royal worth by how many things you could cut in half, Caelum couldn't cut a loaf of bread without help. The court called him the Hollow Prince behind his back, then to his face, then in official documents that he was expected to sign. His father stopped inviting him to military briefings by the time he was 12. His brother stopped sparring with him by 13. His sister still visited, but her eyes carried something worse than contempt. Pity. Caelum retreated to the only place in the palace that didn't judge him, the royal forge, deep in the basement, abandoned for decades. He spent his days there, tinkering with broken weapons and damaged armor. Not fixing them exactly, just understanding how they were put together. The court blacksmith caught him once and laughed so hard he pulled a muscle. A prince playing with hammers, he told the kitchen staff. The empire truly is in decline. Caelum heard that through the walls and kept hammering. On the night of his 18th birthday, everything changed. Not slowly, not gradually, all at once. The empire's enemies, the Ashborn Confederation, launched a surprise attack on the capital. Demon-forged siege weapons punched through the outer walls in minutes. The royal guard held the inner keep, but Ashborn assassins slipped through the chaos. They weren't after the emperor or the war hero prince. They were after the weakest target, the one nobody would waste resources protecting. 3 assassins found Caelum alone in the forge. He tried to fight with a hammer he'd been using to straighten nails. The first assassin knocked it from his hand before he finished raising it. The second put a blade through his chest. The third watched him bleed out on the forge floor and called it a mercy. Caelum died staring at the ceiling of the only room that ever felt like home. Then he woke up. Same forge, same ceiling, same blood on the floor. Except the blood was gone and the wound in his chest had vanished. And floating in front of his eyes was something that hadn't been there before. A translucent blue panel with text that burned itself into his vision. Divine Blacksmith System activated. Host death detected. Temporal reset complete. Current age, 12. Caelum looked down at his hands. Small hands, a child's hands, unmarked by the calluses he'd earned over 6 years. He was 12 years old again. 6 years before the attack. 6 years before his death. 6 years of warning. And a system that was already listing its features in neat blue text. Forge analysis, the ability to see the hidden properties of any material. Blueprint library, access to weapon and armor designs from across all realms. Soul tempering, the ability to strengthen his own body through the forging process. And a skill tree so deep it disappeared off the bottom of the panel. Caelum sat on the forge floor, 12 years old, shaking. Not from fear. From the overwhelming realization that the thing he'd been mocked for his entire life was the key to everything. He didn't waste a single day. In his previous life, he'd spent 6 years tinkering aimlessly in the forge. This time, he had a system, a deadline, and the memory of a blade sliding through his ribs. The first thing he did was activate forge analysis on every piece of metal in the room. The system highlighted properties invisible to the naked eye. Stress fractures in swords that looked perfect. Hidden impurities in steel that would cause catastrophic failure under pressure. Dormant elemental traces in ores that nobody had thought to activate. In 10 minutes, Caelum learned more about metallurgy than the court blacksmith knew. In an hour, he had identified 3 pieces of discarded scrap with hidden potential. By midnight, he had forged his first system-recognized item. A simple iron dagger, nothing fancy, but the system rated it uncommon quality. The court blacksmith's best work was rated common. Caelum held the dagger up to the forged light and something warm spread through his chest. Not the golden light of healing or the crackling energy of combat magic. The quiet satisfaction of making something good with his own hands. Soul tempering activated during the forging process just as the system had promised. Every swing of the hammer sent a pulse of energy through his muscles. His body was being strengthened by the act of creation itself. The more he forged, the stronger he became. Not through training, not through pills or potions or secret techniques. Through craft. He started forging every night after the palace went quiet. Daggers first, then short swords, then full-length blades. Each one better than the last, each one pushing his skill tree deeper. The system unlocked new techniques with every milestone. Heat distribution control at level 5. Elemental infusion at level 10. Structural resonance at level 15. By the time Caelum turned 13, He could forge a sword better than anyone in the capital, and his body, tempered by hundreds of hours at the anvil, was no longer the frail thing it used to be. His arms were dense with muscle hidden beneath loose sleeves. His grip strength could crack stone. His reflexes had sharpened from years of timing hammer strikes to the millisecond. But he kept it all hidden because showing strength in this palace meant being used. And Caelum had 6 years of memories reminding him what being used looked like. The first person to notice something had changed was his sister Serafina. She visited the forge one evening and found him polishing a blade she didn't recognize. "Where did you get that?" she asked, reaching for the sword instinctively. The moment her fingers touched the hilt, her eyes went wide. The balance, the weight, the way it responded to her grip like it was alive. "This is better than anything in the royal armory," she whispered. "Who made this?" Caelum weighed his options in a single heartbeat. Lying would buy time, but Serafina was the only family member who still treated him as human. "I did," he said. She stared at him for a long moment, sword still in her hand. Then she swung it once in a tight arc, and the air split with a sound like tearing silk. Her training dummy across the room fell apart into clean pieces. She hadn't moved from her spot. The blade had channeled her chi without resistance, amplifying her strike beyond normal limits. "Caelum," she said, voice shaking, "this sword is at least imperial grade. How is that possible?" He didn't tell her about the system, or the rebirth, or the 6 years of future knowledge. He told her he'd been practicing in secret and asked her to keep it quiet. She agreed, but she took the sword with her. And from that night on, she visited the forge every week, bringing broken weapons from the armory and watching him repair them in minutes. Each repaired weapon came back sharper, stronger, more responsive than its original form. Serafina stopped pitying her brother. She started protecting him, because she understood, faster than anyone else would, what a talent like this was worth, and what people would do to control it. 6 months later, the first real test arrived. The annual imperial tournament, where princes proved their worth through combat. Caelum was expected to attend, sit in the stands, and watch his brother win. Again. This time, Caelum entered, not as a fighter, as an equipment sponsor. The rules allowed any noble to provide custom weapons for tournament combatants. Caelum offered his services to the most underestimated fighter in the bracket, a low-ranked knight named Bren who had never made it past the second round. Bren was skilled, but his equipment was garbage because he couldn't afford better. Caelum forged him a complete set overnight. Sword, shield, chestplate, gauntlets, all rated rare quality by the system. Each piece designed specifically for Bren's fighting style and body measurements. When Bren picked up the sword, his jaw dropped. It felt like an extension of his arm, perfectly weighted, perfectly balanced. The tournament that followed rewrote the court's understanding of combat. Bren, the nobody knight who'd never won a meaningful bout, tore through the bracket. His sword cut through reinforced shields like they were made of cheese. His armor deflected strikes that should have caved in his chest. Opponents with twice his rank couldn't land a clean hit because his equipment compensated. He reached the semifinals before finally losing to Lucian, the crown prince himself. And even that fight was close enough to make Lucian sweat publicly for the first time. The court was stunned. Where did this nobody get equipment that rivaled the royal collection? Bren, to his credit, pointed directly at Caelum in the stands. "The trash prince forged everything I'm wearing." The silence that followed was deafening. Then the whispers started, and they spread like fire through dry grass. Emperor Darius summoned Caelum to the throne room that evening. It was the first time his father had asked to see him in over a year. Caelum walked through doors he hadn't been invited through since childhood. His father sat on the throne looking at him the way a general evaluates an unexpected resource. Not with pride, with calculation. "You made that knight's equipment," the emperor said. "I did." "How?" "Practice," Caelum replied, keeping his voice level. "I've been working in the forge for years. Nobody paid attention, so nobody noticed." That last part landed harder than any weapon Caelum had ever forged. His father's jaw tightened. Not from anger, from the recognition that his son was right. The emperor ordered Caelum to forge weapons for the royal guard as a trial. If the quality matched the tournament showing, he would receive official backing. Caelum accepted, but on his own terms. He wanted his own forge, separate from the palace smithy. His own supply chain for materials, with no court blacksmith interference, and the right to choose his own clients. The emperor raised an eyebrow at a 13-year-old making demands. But the tournament results were still echoing through every noble house in the capital. He agreed. Caelum's forge, officially named the Third Prince's Workshop, opened within a month. It was small, barely more than the abandoned basement he'd started in. But it was his, and the system recognized it as a proper crafting station. New features unlocked immediately. Material synthesis, combining 2 or more base metals into alloys with unique properties. enchantment weaving, embedding permanent magical effects directly into forged items, and something called masterwork potential, which appeared only on items forged with perfect focus. The first weapon Caelum produced in his new forge was a longsword for Serafina. He spent 3 days on it, pouring everything the system had taught him into the design. The blade was made from a synthesized alloy of star iron and volcanic glass. It could channel 3 elements simultaneously without degrading. The system rated it epic quality, the first epic item Caelum had ever produced. When Serafina tested it in the training yard, she destroyed the yard. Not figuratively, she literally shattered the reinforced stone floor with a single downward strike. The sword had amplified her chi output by roughly 300%. She stood in the craters she'd made, breathing hard, staring at the weapon in her hands. "This is too much," she said. Caelum disagreed. "In 6 years, the Ashborn will attack the city with demon-forged siege weapons. Nothing we currently have can stop them." Serafina looked at him with an expression he'd never seen from her before. "How do you know that?" He couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. "I've read the intelligence reports," he lied smoothly. "The patterns are obvious if anyone bothers to look." She didn't believe him, but she didn't push. Because the sword in her hands was proof that her little brother knew things he shouldn't. And whatever the source, the result was undeniable. Over the next years, Caelum's workshop became the worst-kept secret in the capital. Every knight who received his equipment saw their combat performance jump dramatically. Border garrisons equipped with his weapons reported casualty drops of over 40%. His armor saved lives that standard issue gear would have lost. And every piece was custom, designed for the specific user's body and fighting style. No mass production, no template designs, every item a unique creation. The court blacksmiths went from laughing at him to quietly requesting apprenticeships. He declined all of them because he couldn't explain the system. But he started publishing simplified technique guides that improved the general craft level. If he couldn't share the system itself, he could share the thinking behind it. Proper heat distribution, stress point analysis, alloy compatibility charts. Knowledge that the blacksmithing guild had been hoarding as trade secrets for generations. Suddenly available to anyone willing to read. The guild master sent an angry letter. Caelum sent back a dagger that was better than anything the guild could produce. The letters stopped. By 15, Caelum's body had been tempered through thousands of hours of forging. His physical stats rivaled trained knights, though he still avoided public sparring. The system had unlocked advanced body tempering that converted forged heat into constitution. His bones were denser than normal, his muscles harder, his endurance almost inhuman. When a practice sword broke during a private session with Serafina, he caught the flying shard out of the air with his bare hand. The shard, traveling fast enough to embed in stone, stopped in his palm without drawing blood. Serafina stopped mid-swing and stared at his hand. "You're not just a blacksmith anymore," she said quietly. "I was never just a blacksmith," Caelum replied. Everyone else just couldn't see past the hammer. The real turning point came when the system unlocked a tier Caelum hadn't expected. Legendary Forge, available only after producing 100 epic quality items. The new tier gave him access to materials and techniques from other dimensions. Celestial iron, void crystal, dragon bone composite, materials that didn't exist in his world. The system could synthesize small amounts from local materials at enormous energy cost. But the results were beyond anything the Empire had ever seen. Caelum's first legendary item was a shield for Bren, the knight who'd trusted him first. The shield could absorb kinetic energy from impacts and redirect it as a counterforce. Hit it harder, and it hit back harder. When Bren tested it against a charging war mount, the horse bounced backward 20 feet. Bren didn't move an inch. The military command office requested a meeting the next day. General Aldrich, the Empire's supreme commander and Caelum's uncle, arrived personally. He was a massive man with scars older than most of his officers. He examined Bren's shield, tested its weight, struck it once with his gauntleted fist. The counterforce nearly dislocated his shoulder, and he burst out laughing. Then he turned to Caelum with the first genuine respect anyone in the family had shown. "Boy, if you can make 100 of these, I'll win the next war before breakfast." "I can't make 100, Caelum said honestly. "Each one is unique, and the materials are limited. But I can make something better for each of your top commanders. Weapons and armor designed specifically for their abilities and weaknesses." General Aldrich stared at him for a long beat, then grinned. "Your father called you the Hollow Prince. I'm starting to think he's the Blind Emperor." That comment, overheard by 3 aides, spread through the capital by sunset. The political implications were immediate and messy. Lucian, the crown prince, had built his claim to succession on military prowess. If the Empire's weapons became more important than its warriors, then the person who made the weapons held more real power than the person who swung them. Lucian was smart enough to see this, and threatened enough to act on it. He visited the workshop exactly once. Not to admire the work, to deliver a warning. Stay in your forge, little brother, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Leave the empire to the people who can actually fight for it. Caelum didn't respond with words. He held up a dagger he'd been working on and triggered its enchantment. The blade lit up with blue-white fire that made the air in the room vibrate. Lucian's hand went to his sword instinctively. That's a reflex, Caelum said calmly. You grab your weapon because you felt threatened by mine. Imagine how the Ashborn will feel when every soldier in our army carries one. He deactivated the enchantment and set the dagger down. I don't want your throne, Lucian. I want a forge and enough materials to fill it. You can have the empire, just make sure there's one left to have. Lucian left without another word, but the warning had been received by both sides. The political games were starting, and Caelum's forge was now at the center of them. Over the following year, Caelum quietly began preparing for what he knew was coming. He mapped the Ashborn attack patterns from his previous life's memories. The breach points in the outer wall, the timing of the siege weapon deployment, the assassination routes the infiltrators would use, and the demon-forged cores that powered the Ashborn's most devastating weapons. In his first life, those cores have been impenetrable mysteries. With the system's forge analysis, Caelum could now see exactly how they worked, and more importantly, how they could be countered. He designed a new type of defensive ward, forged directly into the wall's structural metal. Not painted on or enchanted over, actually integrated into the alloy itself. The system called it structural enchantment, a technique that no one else could replicate, because it required seeing the metal's molecular structure and working at that level. Over 6 months, Caelum secretly reinforced critical sections of the capital's outer wall, working at night, telling the guards he was testing materials. Nobody questioned the Trash Prince's late-night hammer sessions because nobody cared, which was exactly how he wanted it. The wall sections he reinforced became effectively indestructible. Demon-forged siege weapons that would have punched through in seconds would now shatter against metal that had been reforged from the inside out. He also built personal equipment for a select team he was quietly assembling. Gren received a full legendary set, sword and shield and armor that made him near invincible. Seraphina's sword was upgraded with void crystal channeling for dimension-cutting strikes. Captain Rena, a border officer Caelum had met through supply requests, got enchanted arrows. Each arrow could punch through demon-forged plate at 300 meters. And for himself, Caelum forged something the system called a soul anvil, a portable forge compressed into a bracer on his left wrist. With it, he could create or modify weapons in the field in real time during actual combat. The soul anvil was rated mythic, the highest tier the system had ever shown him. It pulsed against his skin like a second heartbeat made of fire and iron. When the Ashborn finally came, Caelum was ready in ways nobody expected. 3 years ahead of his previous life's timeline. The attack didn't come at 18 this time, it came at 15. The system's changes to the world had accelerated the enemy's plans. Demon-forged weapons hitting the market had put pressure on the Confederation to strike early, before the Empire's new equipment advantage became insurmountable. The siege began at midnight, exactly as Caelum remembered. But the results were nothing like his memories. The first wave of siege weapon fire hit the outer wall and bounced. Not cracked, not weakened, bounced, like throwing rocks at a mountain. The Ashborn commanders stared at the undamaged wall in visible confusion. Their intelligence said those sections should have collapsed in seconds. They fired again, concentrating every siege weapon on a single point. The wall absorbed the impacts without a scratch, because Caelum had reforged the molecular structure of every stone in that section. The metal framework wasn't just holding the wall together, it was actively redistributing force across the entire structure. Hit one brick, and every brick shared the load. You'd have to hit them all at once to break through, and that wasn't physically possible. While the siege weapons pounded uselessly, Caelum moved to the second phase. The assassins. He knew the route because he died to it in his first life. 3 infiltrators would enter through the eastern Cerberus tunnels. In his previous life, they'd reached the forge and killed him without opposition. This time, Caelum was waiting in the tunnel with the soul anvil active. The first assassin came around the corner and met a warhammer that didn't exist 2 seconds ago. Caelum had forged it from the tunnel's own iron brackets while walking. The hammer connected with the assassin's chest and sent him through the opposite wall. The second assassin threw a demon-forged blade at his throat. Caelum caught it, analyzed it with forge analysis in a fraction of a second, found the stress fracture at the base of the tang, and snapped the blade in half with one hand. He dropped the pieces, reformed his hammer into a sword, and met the third assassin's charge. 3 exchanges, each one showing Caelum exactly how demon-forged steel moved and failed. On the 4th exchange, his blade found the gap in the assassin's armor he'd mapped in real time. The fight was over in under 20 seconds. 3 assassins who had killed him in his previous life. handled by a 15-year-old prince with a sword he'd made from tunnel brackets. Caelum looked at the unconscious bodies and felt something complicated settle in his chest. Not satisfaction, not revenge, something closer to a debt being paid. He handed the assassins to the guards and walked to the outer wall. The Ashborn were still pounding away, their commanders growing increasingly desperate. On the wall, General Aldrich was coordinating the defense with barely contained glee. Their siege weapons are useless, he laughed. What did you do to this wall, boy? Caelum looked out at the enemy army and made a decision he hadn't planned for. He raised his left arm and activated the soul anvil at full power. Metal from every broken weapon on the battlefield, scattered debris from the siege impacts. All of it responded to his call. Thousands of metal fragments lifted from the ground and streaked toward his position. They merged, reformed, and shaped themselves in midair into a massive ballista bolt 15 feet long, glowing with structural enchantment. Caelum pointed at the largest siege weapon in the Ashborn line. The bolt launched with a crack that shattered windows across the district. It hit the demon-forged siege engine dead center, and the machine ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not damaged, erased. The structural enchantment in the bolt unraveled the demon forging from the inside. Exactly the way Caelum had designed it, a forge technique weaponized. The Ashborn army watched their greatest weapon vanish and the charge died in their throats. Within the hour, the Confederation forces began retreating. Not because the wall fell, because it couldn't fall. Not because the army was destroyed, because the tools they brought were countered perfectly by a boy who had spent 3 years preparing for this exact night. The aftermath was chaos. The Empire had just repelled the most significant military assault in a generation. And the hero wasn't a warrior, a general, or mage. It was the trash prince with a hammer. Emperor Darius called Caelum to the throne room the next morning. This time, the room was full, every noble house, every military commander, every court official. Caelum walked through the same doors he'd been excluded from for years. His father looked at him differently now, not with calculation, with something raw. The unsettling recognition that his disposable son had just saved his empire. The emperor offered him anything: title, lands, military command, a seat on the council. Caelum asked for one thing: a forge. Not a workshop in a basement, not a converted storage room. A real forge, with proper ventilation, unlimited material access, and complete autonomy. Where he could build what the empire needed without anyone telling him what that was. The emperor granted it without hesitation. General Aldrich added something of his own. A permanent military contract that guaranteed Caelum's forge was classified as a strategic asset, meaning no noble house, no political faction, not even the crown prince, could interfere with his work or claim his products without his direct consent. Lucian's face went carefully blank when that announcement was read, but his hands, gripping the armrest of his chair, were white-knuckled. The forge that Caelum built over the following year became the most important building. Not the grandest, not the most beautiful. The most important, because everything the Empire used to defend itself passed through those doors. Weapons that could counter demon forging. Armor that redistributed impact across entire formations. Communication devices forged from resonance metal that worked across any distance. Siege defense arrays that could be installed in any wall within hours. Medical equipment that accelerated healing through vibration forging. Agricultural tools enchanted to double crop yields in poor soil. Caelum didn't just forge weapons. He forged infrastructure. Roads reinforced with structural enchantment that never needed repair. Bridges that could hold 10 times their rated weight. Water pipes that purified contamination through embedded filtration arrays. Each invention solved a problem that the Empire had been living with for generations, because nobody had ever thought to apply legendary tier crafting to plumbing. Caelum did, because a forge that only makes swords is a forge that misses the point. The point was never destruction. It was creation. Making things that people needed, from weapons to water pipes, and doing it so well that the world reorganized itself around the forge instead of the throne. That shift terrified some people and inspired others. Lucian saw a threat to his succession and began building political alliances against Caelum. Seraphina saw a brother she'd underestimated and pledged to protect him personally. General Aldrich saw the future of warfare and funded every project without question. The court blacksmiths saw their obsolescence and either adapted or retired. And the common people saw water pipes that worked and roads that didn't crack, and decided that whatever else the trash prince was, he was useful. Useful enough to forgive the years of mockery. Useful enough to line up outside his forge with broken plows and dull axes. Useful enough to name their children after him, which was both touching and embarrassing. Caelum handled the attention the same way he handled metal, with steady hands and zero wasted motion. He never gave speeches, never attended court functions, never played political games. He just forged, and the world came to him. 3 years after the siege, on the day Caelum turned 18, the anniversary of his death in his previous life. He stood in his forge, soul anvil pulsing gently on his wrist, and looked at the weapon rack lining the wall. Hundreds of items he'd created over 6 years, each one rated rare or above. Swords that sang when drawn, shields that absorbed impacts like water absorbs stones, armor that bent but never broke, tools that made harvest double and bridges last forever. Every single one started as raw metal and an idea. Every single one was shaped by hands that people used to call useless. The system panel floated at the edge of his vision, skill tree stretching into depths. He'd reached levels that the system hadn't even named yet. Soul tempering had made his body stronger than most trained warriors. Forge analysis let him see the hidden nature of any material on the continent. The soul anvil let him forge weapons from battlefield debris in real time. And the blueprint library held designs from realms that this world didn't know existed. All of it built from the same place he started. A boy in a basement, hitting metal with a hammer. Because that's what everyone else saw and dismissed. They saw a prince who couldn't fight and called him trash. They saw a forge and called it a hobby. They saw a hammer and called it a toy. And they missed what was actually happening. A craftsman was building, piece by piece, the foundation that would hold the empire together. While everyone else was busy swinging swords and competing for glory, the person in the basement was making sure those swords actually worked, that those shields actually held, that those walls actually stood, that the empire had something worth fighting for beyond pride and power. Working roads and clean water, and tools that didn't break at harvest time. The boring stuff that nobody writes songs about, but that everyone notices when it stops working. Caelum's father finally understood this, 3 years too late. He visited the forge the night before Caelum's 18th birthday. Not as the emperor, just as a father who had failed his son and knew it. "I called you hollow," Darius said, standing in a forge that hummed with power. Every wall lined with creations worth more than the throne he sat on. "I was wrong." Caelum set down his hammer and looked at his father. 6 years of resentment, 6 years of being dismissed, 6 years of dying and coming back. All of it compressed into a single moment. "I know," Caelum said, and went back to work. Because forgiveness wasn't something you handed out in dramatic moments. It was something that happened slowly, over time, through actions. His father had called him hollow. His forge had filled the empire with everything it needed. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The night of his 18th birthday, Caelum didn't celebrate. He forged, the same way he'd spent the night of his previous life's death. In the same basement, at the same anvil, with the same steady rhythm. Except this time, nobody was coming to kill him. The assassin's route was sealed. The walls were unbreakable. And the prince who couldn't hold a sword was the most important person in the empire. Not because of what he could destroy, because of what he could create. Serafina found him at midnight, still hammering. "Happy birthday," she said, leaning against the door frame with her epic tear sword on her hip. He held up the piece he'd been working on, a small medallion that glowed with faint blue light. A personal protection charm forged from celestial iron, rated legendary. Designed to absorb one fatal strike and convert it into healing energy. "For you," he said, and pressed it into her palm. She looked at it, then at him, and her eyes glistened in the forged light. "You made me a legendary item for my birthday gift." "No," he said. "I made you a legendary item because you were the only one who visited me in the basement. The birthday is a coincidence." She laughed, and for a moment they were just siblings in a warm room. Not a princess and a prince, not a warrior and a smith, just family. The kind of family that isn't given but forged, slowly, through years of showing up. The empire called him the Divine Blacksmith after the siege. A title he didn't ask for and didn't particularly like. He preferred just Caelum, or if pressed, the Forge Kid. Because titles were what other people used to define you. And Caelum had spent his entire first life being defined by what he couldn't do. In this life, he defined himself by what he built. Swords for knights who fought on borders. Shields for soldiers who held walls. Plows for farmers who fed cities. Pipes for villages that needed clean water. Roads for merchants who connected the empire. And a medallion for a sister who never stopped visiting. Every item, from the mythic soul anvil to the simplest repaired plow, was made with the same hands, the same focus, the same respect for the craft. Because a prince who treats a farmer's plow with the same care as a general's sword is a prince who understands what actually holds a kingdom together. Not the throne, not the army, not the political alliances. The tools, the bridges and the roads and the water pipes and the harvest equipment. The boring, essential, unglamorous infrastructure that everyone depends on, and that everyone ignores until it breaks. Caelum made sure it never broke. That was his real power. Not the system, not the soul anvil, not the legendary materials from other dimensions. the understanding that a kingdom runs on plows as much as swords, and that the person who maintains both is more valuable than the person who swings either. They called him the Trash Prince. Then they called him the Hollow Prince. Then they called him the Forge Kid. Then they called him the Divine Blacksmith. Caelum answered to all of them and was defined by none, because names are what other people give you, and the only name that mattered was the one he gave himself: Craftsman. Not warrior, not prince, not hero, not legend. Craftsman. The person who makes things. Useful things, beautiful things, impossible things, mundane things. All of them necessary. All of them made with care. All of them part of the empire that his family ruled and that his forge held together. The emperor sat on a throne of gold and velvet. Caelum stood at an anvil of iron and fire, and the anvil, it turned out, was the stronger seat, because thrones depend on the loyalty of people, and people's loyalty depends on whether their tools work and their water is clean. Give them those things and they'll follow you anywhere. Caelum gave them those things, one forged item at a time. The forge burns hot tonight, the same way it is every night for 6 years. The anvil rings with a steady rhythm that Caelum knows better than his own heartbeat. Metal glows orange, then white, then takes the shape his hands demand. Not his hands alone anymore. The soul anvil amplifies every strike into precision creation. Tomorrow there will be orders to fill. Swords, shields, plows, pipes, bridge reinforcements, medical equipment. The list never ends because a living empire always needs something fixed, or something new, or something nobody has thought of yet that will solve a problem they didn't know they had. Caelum lives for those moments. When a farmer picks up a repair plow and says it's better than the day I bought it. When a knight survives a blow that should have killed him because the armor held. When a village drinks clean water for the first time because the pipes actually work. Those moments are worth more than any title or trophy. They're the reason he came back. Not the system, not the timeline reset, not the revenge or the preparation. The chance to stand at an anvil and make something that matters. He died once in this forge, with a blade in his chest and nobody coming to help. He came back to the same forge with a system and a mission, and turned the place where he died into the heart of an empire. That's not revenge. That's craft. The purest, most powerful, most underrated force in any world. The ability to take raw material and make it into something that changes lives. A sword changes a battle. A plow changes a harvest. A pipe changes a village. A forge changes an empire. And a boy who was called Trash changed everything. Not by proving he could fight, by proving he could build. The hammer falls one more time, and the piece is finished. Caelum holds it up to the forged light, checking for flaws he knows aren't there. Because the system confirms it, and his own eyes confirm it, and his hands know it by feel. Perfect. The way everything he makes is perfect. Not because of the system. Because of the 6 years of practice in his first life when nobody was watching. And the 6 years of purpose in his second life when everyone was. 12 years of hitting metal and learning what it can become. That's not a system bonus. That's mastery. The system gave him tools. The mastery was earned, hammer stroke by hammer stroke. Alone in a basement that smelled like iron and determination. While the rest of the palace called him empty. He was never empty. He was full of blueprints and metallurgy and the stubborn patience of a craftsman. They just couldn't see it because they were looking for sword skills. And Caelum's skill was the forge. The thing that made the swords possible in the first place. The foundation beneath the weapon. The fire beneath the steel. The hands beneath the empire. They called him the Trash Prince because he couldn't swing a sword. He forged every sword worth swinging. They called him hollow because he had no combat talent. He filled the empire with everything it needed to survive. They killed him because he was the weakest target. He came back and made sure weakness was never a death sentence again. Not just for himself. For every soldier wearing his armor. For every farmer using his tools. For every village drinking his water. For every knight carrying his shield into battle. For every sister wearing his medallion close to her heart. Caelum sets the finished piece on the rack beside hundreds of others. Each one a story, each one a problem solved, each one a life protected. The forge cools slowly around him as the fire dies down to embers. Tomorrow it will burn again, the same way it has since he was 12. Since before the system, before the rebirth, before any of it. When he was just a boy in a basement, hitting metal because it was the only thing that felt right. That feeling hasn't changed. Everything else has. The Trash Prince is the empire's most important person. The Hollow Prince filled a kingdom. The boy who died alone in a forge now has a sister, an army, and a nation behind him. And a forge that never stops burning. Because there's always something to build. Always a sword to sharpen. Always a plow to repair. Always a wall to reinforce. Always a pipe to lay. Always someone who needs something made with care. and Caelum Voss, third prince, divine blacksmith, craftsman, will be standing at his anvil when they arrive, hammer in hand, fire at his back, ready to make whatever they need. The same way he's been ready since he was 12 years old, alone in a basement, with nothing but a hammer and the quiet certainty that someday, somebody would realize that the boy who couldn't swing a sword was the one who forged them all. The forge goes dark, the embers glow, the anvil cools, and Caelum walks to the window and looks out at the city his weapons protect. The walls he reinforced glow faintly blue in the moonlight. The roads he forged carry late-night merchants toward morning markets. The water pipes he laid hum beneath the streets, delivering clean water while the city sleeps. All of it his work, all of it invisible to anyone not looking. And that's fine, because the best work is the kind nobody notices. Until the wall holds and the water flows and the plow doesn't break at harvest. Then they notice. Then they understand. Then they remember the boy in the basement who hit metal until it sang. They called him trash. He built an empire. They called him hollow. He filled a kingdom. They killed him. He came back, and he forged everything. The swords that defended, the shields that protected, the armor that saved, the walls that held, the roads that connected, the pipes that cleansed, the plows that fed, the bridges that lasted, the medallion that said I love you in a language only siblings understand. All forged by the same hands, in the same fire, with the same steady rhythm. That started in a basement and ended up holding a nation together. Caelum Voss, Trash Prince, Hollow Prince, Forge Kid, Divine Blacksmith, Craftsman, the man who died because he couldn't fight, and came back to build everything worth fighting for. The forge will burn again tomorrow. The hammer will ring, the metal will glow, and Caelum will stand where he's always stood, at the center of creation, building, always building, not because the world asked him to, because the world needed him to, and because a craftsman who stops building stops being a craftsman. Caelum never stopped. From the first dagger in a dark basement to the mythic soul anvil on his wrist, from the death that started everything to the life he built from its ashes. One hammer stroke at a time, one perfect piece at a time. The Trash Prince forged an empire, and his fire is nowhere near going out.